Richard Nixon was the 37th President of the United States. Previously Lyndon B. Johnson's vice president, Nixon ran as the Republican candidate in the 1968 election. Nixon graduated from Duke University School of Law in 1937, and after serving on active duty in the Navy during World War II, he began his career in politics. Nixon was first elected to the House of Representatives in 1946 and made it into the Senate in 1950. Furthering his career, he ran for governor of California in 1962, although he lost to his competition, Pat Brown. Once he became president in 1969, Nixon started what would become one of the most controversial and well-known presidencies to date. By the end of his first term in office, he had ended the American involvement in Vietnam, brought home many POWs from internment camps, and ended the military draft that had been running in the States. Nixon was also president during the Apollo 11 mission, which put the first man on the moon, and he greatly enforced the desegregation of Southern schools. It was not until the end of Nixon's first term in 1972 that controversy over his role as president first started to rise.
With the country divided over the Vietnam War, Nixon and his advisors deemed it necessary to run a very aggressive re-election campaign. Their tactics, however, were not only dirty and secret, but were illegal. In May of 1972, members of CREEP, also known as Nixon's Committee to Re-elect the President, broke into the Democratic National Committee's Watergate headquarters and stole copies of top-secret documents and bugged the office's phones. When the wiretaps proceeded to fail, another break-in was arranged. On June 17th, 5 men were preparing to enter the office when a guard noticed some locks taped over, and this time they were caught red-handed. The connection to Nixon wasn't very clear at first, though, and this led to one of the largest cover-ups in American history.
1972 is one of the largest landslide victories by any president. Between Richard Nixon and Herbert Humphrey, Nixon won with a total of 97% of the electoral votes, with every state but Massachusetts. This was the first election in which the voting age was lowered from 21 years old to 18 years old. Allegations against Nixon surrounding the break-in of the Watergate complex had been building, and there was a considerable amount of controversy. But he was able to win the election by stressing the success he had in his former term with foreign affairs, while his opponent pushed for universal minimum wage and an immediate end to the Vietnam War. When comparing the popular vote, Nixon had a full 60.7%, while Humphrey had only 37.5%. This meant that he had 18 million more votes than Humphrey, giving him the largest victory margin in history.
On January 30th of 1973, 2 former officials of President Nixon's re-election committee, G. Gordon Liddy and James W. McCord Jr., were convicted of conspiracy, burglary, and bugging the Democratic Party's Watergate headquarters. 5 other men also pleaded guilty to the charges earlier in the proceedings, and the close ties to Nixon increased the suspicion and scrutiny he was under tremendously.
John Dean, an attorney who served as a White House counsel for Richard Nixon, released to Watergate investigators that he and Nixon had discussed Watergate at least 35 times. Until this point, Nixon had been taking a firm stance that he had no involvement in this case and that it had all happened underneath his nose. John Dean had, until this point, not released any of this information to the press and had kept it all in confidentiality. However, he had just recently been let go by Nixon, so his ties were broken. He told Watergate investigators that he had spoken directly to Nixon or in his presence about the scandal upwards of 35 times. He said that Nixon had a complete understanding of the break-in and the money used to buy silence from the burglars. Although Dean did not have any hard evidence other than his words, he agreed to go under oath and retail everything despite the fact of him not having complete immunity. He proved that Nixon was deeply involved in the cover-up and could not separate himself from it anymore.
In July of 1973, Alexander P. Butterfield announced that the Nixon administration had bugged and recorded every conversation in the White House since 1971. Butterfield, who was the Federal Aviation Administration administrator, revealed that they had been keeping the records for posterity and for the Nixon library. The tapes had the potential to save Nixon if nothing incriminating was found, or they could be used as primary evidence against him and lead to the first impeachment of the president in United States history.
Everything that has been said in the Oval Office has been recorded could easily have ended the entire investigation into the Watergate scandal and either proven President Nixon guilty or shown the United States' innocence. However, Nixon refused to hand over the recordings to either the Senate Watergate Committee or one of the main prosecutors, Archibald Cox. Although Nixon did have the legal right to refuse the requests, his action raised enough suspicion for Cox to subpoena one of Nixon's lawyers, J. Fred Buzzhart, which made it illegal for Nixon to refuse to hand over the tapes again. The Senate Watergate Committee followed soon after and served 2 subpoenas onto another one of Nixon's lawyers, Leonard Garment. These legal actions allowed the Nixon administration only 2 days before having to respond.
Same year, an event called the Saturday Night Massacre occurred, in which President Nixon fired Archibald Cox, abolishing his former position as special prosecutor. This firing happened because Nixon had ordered Cox to essentially make no further effort to obtain the tapes or any other presidential documents. Cox refused to comply with this agreement and actually elaborated further on his reasons in a news conference before he was fired. The Saturday Night Massacre also claimed the resignations of Attorney General Elliot L. Richardson and Deputy Attorney General William D. Ruckelshaws, who both refused to fire Cox. Finally, the president had turned to Solicitor General Robert H. Bork, who by law becomes acting Attorney General when the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General are absent, and he carried out the president's order to fire Cox. These events put even more pressure on Congress to push for the president's impeachment.
Finally, the tapes were surrendered to the prosecutors, and it was thought that this would be the end of the scandal. Once the prosecutors obtained the tapes and started to review them, they realized that in one of the tapes, an 18-and-a-half-minute portion of one of them was missing. According to Nixon's secretary, she accidentally taped over the first 5 minutes of the recording when she reached to answer a phone call. The controversy around this absent section blew up. The public berated Nixon with questions. What was he hiding? How could such a long section be covered? And what was the other 13.5 minutes? The media was invited to review a rendition performed by the secretary, Mary Rose Woods, in which she pretended to go through the entire scenario once more. The media reported that the stretch she had to make, in addition to holding it for an entire 5 minutes, and the model of recording machine she had made it not a plausible story. Nixon, however, continued to stick with the story, which completely ended any support he had with independents and Democrats, and greatly reduced the number of Republicans that favored him.
The Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Nixon must hand over 64 of the White House tapes involved in the Watergate break-in, rejecting his claim of executive privilege. The tapes were the final bit of evidence required to begin the impeachment process, as they showed that Nixon was directly involved in the Watergate break-in.
With his continually decreasing popularity, it is no surprise that the House Judiciary Committee began the first 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon.
The Committee passed the first of 3 articles of impeachment charging obstruction of justice. Nixon became the first U.S. president to resign. His vice president, Gerald Ford, took office, and he later pardoned Nixon of any crimes committed at the National Democratic Watergate headquarters.
Almost exactly 30 years after the famous break-in, a new and shocking revelation came to light. An anonymous source shared that Nixon himself directly ordered the break-in to the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel complex.
On June 1st of 2005, Deep Throat, an anonymous source whose insider guidance was vital to the Washington Post's groundbreaking coverage of the Watergate scandal, was revealed to be a pillar of the FBI named W. Mark Felt. Without his knowledge and information that he leaked to the public, the incriminating evidence to impeach Nixon would never have been revealed.
The entire scandal surrounding the break-in of the Watergate hotel complex has changed the way that politics in America and the world are conducted. The public no longer has the same faith in the president that they once had. The Supreme Court also showed that they are still the most powerful source in the nation. Not even the president could overturn their ruling.